Let me start talking about what I really want to, discuss with you today. First of all, since Rasika very kindly announced the title of my paper, I don't have to repeat that. I want to speak, yes, in the context of neoliberalism, but surely that begs the question, what is it that I mean by neoliberalism? Because surely it can mean many things. For instance, it can mean a certain historical phase in the history of capitalism, from industrial capitalism in the 19th century to something like late capitalism in the 20th to neoliberalism, probably a kind of marked by a Thatcherite period in the 70s onwards up to the present. That's one way of looking at neoliberalism. But neoliberalism can also be seen in the context of something like power, which means a kind of regime of neoliberal power, which often is also very interestingly termed by certain thinkers. Wolfgang Streeck, for instance, a German critic of political economy, he term neo-feudalism for the kind of oligarchic power that dominates global oligarchy, that dominates neoliberal power. So that's another way of looking at neoliberalism. But there's a third way, which is, I mean, there are several other ways, but there's another third way, which is really the way I would like to really talk about neoliberalism today, which is a kind of neoliberalism in crisis. And in the pandemic times, in which the COVID situation, not behind us, but with us, really, the question of crisis is not unknown to us at all. At the same time, how does one really think of capitalism in crisis, insofar as crisis seems to be the very lifeblood of capitalism? But neoliberal capitalism, there is also the neoliberal phase of capitalism. There is also a certain, what I'll call the subjective side to this question, which is how does, and let me use this term very provisionally at this point, the subject in neoliberal times really responds to crisis, which could be a crisis of capitalism, but which also could be a contingent, unwarned, unforeseen crisis like the pandemic one. So what is interesting is that in this case, we are not really talking about a triumphant period of neoliberalism, but clearly where neoliberalism is shaky and globalization is also in a kind of oscillating mode where you're moving between the irreversible conditions of globalization on the one hand, also local retreats to the more traditional form of the state, the nation state. This is something that we've seen during the pandemic times in the last 2 years. In this kind of a set of circumstances, how does one think of neoliberalism in the sense of what I will call, following several others, of course, neoliberal society? And to that extent, alongside neoliberal culture. How does a neoliberal culture, whose material conditions seem to be now globalized in a very real historical way, respond to a crisis which really also forces it to retreat into more local, more provincial, more sort of egoistic, self-centered modes of cultural being, social being. In my view, it is exactly in this crisis that neoliberalism puts its subjective tests to real people who live in crisis. And what it tells people is that learn to love neoliberalism when neoliberalism is not doing well. I think that test is what I really want to mark out for you as the background, the subjective test of capitalism as a background of what I want to talk to you about today in a more theoretical fashion, which I'll come to in a moment. So what does it mean to say that learn to love neoliberalism when neoliberalism is not doing well and globalization is not doing well? What it really means is that you're solicited or you're incited to, as a human being, as part of human society, to look at yourself as someone who actually, in a crisis, really plumbs the depth of his or her deepest faculties or deepest capacities to create or improvise a certain kind of life which is sub-institutional, which is not institutional because global institutions are in crisis, clearly. But it is exactly at this point that you are incited to improvise, and I use the word improvise, which is from the vocabulary of theater very consciously, improvise a sub-institutional life. And a sub-institutional life is what sociologists from Emile Durkheim onward, and Wolfgang Streeck also uses this term, is when society is less than society. And society is really, it is coming apart at its seams. In the lines of the fault lines, the lines of fissure are opening up very visibly. It is exactly at this time, in society being in a state of less than society, that individuals are paradoxically asked to believe in themselves anthropologically, that anthropologically, essentially as human beings, your faculties of improvisation are now to be optimized, to be exerted. And in that sense, don't give up on what neoliberalism calls, in a kind of biopolitical language, your capacity for enterprise, your capacity for being an enterprise of yourself, entrepreneur of yourself. Don't give up on that. So that's why, very interestingly, it is within the neoliberal logic, and at the same time, in the logic which includes the crisis of the, say, Indian society at present, particularly in the domain of education, because as we know with the pandemic, so many young children have fallen out of the educational ladder. It is exactly at this time when the Delhi government, run by the Aam Aadmi Party, as some of you know, makes an education policy where their deputy chief minister actually runs a very sort of sensational slogan that our education policy is now oriented not for job seekers, but for job creators, for entrepreneurs, which is a very strange thing to say, because really job seekers, job creators are making jobs for real human beings. So which means you're already creating a hierarchy between enterprise and labor in your education policy in the present time. And in that sense, you are both responding to the crisis of employment at the present moment, and yet you are imposing a kind of neoliberal vision of all human beings being fundamentally anthropological subjects, which also means that every human being is a subject of enterprise, or is an entrepreneur of oneself. And education is meant to sort of mobilize that. So it is in this sense of neoliberalism as a kind of subjective culture, or a culture of improvisation of life itself at a sub-institutional level, that I want to talk about certain categories which are labor, service, and performance in a somewhat genealogical fashion, going back to some earlier texts from a pre-neoliberal period of capitalism, which is from Karl Marx himself in 1857, in his text of Grundrisse, the groundwork of the capital, which is, of course, the sort of threshold of the great industrial revolution in capitalism, when he's writing the text of Grundrisse. And at that time, he is really extremely impatient towards something like the human being taken as someone who is a purely living human being at the level of something which could only be called as spontaneous, as not oriented to be a productive worker, who doesn't produce things, who doesn't produce something which is a finished work, but who simply improvises or simply lives life at such a level that life and work cannot be distinguished from each other. In that sense, in Grundrisse, you find Marx rather impatient and even dismissive of all improvisations of life, or in that sense, all work of life which do not lead to objects of utility and eventually objects of capitalization, finished works. And here he makes a distinction between two kinds of work, the work that he calls service and the work that he calls labor. And here labor is really defined by being productive, as opposed to service, which seems to be something which and he takes examples of that, which he thinks of as absolutely essential, but not significant in the sense of political economy, in the sense of something which can be valued or valorized as commodity, as contributing to the logic of capital, in the sense that capital is a logic of extraction of surplus value. So he takes the example in several places, actually, in the Grundrisse. For instance, he takes the example from an earlier economist called Senior of the pianist. And he talks about the absolute common sense, which is also an ontological common sense of the fact, the common sense understanding, understanding of the fact that without the playing of the piano, the making of the piano makes no sense. But at the same time, he says that the pianist really does not count as productive labor. It is a kind of service to the listeners. But the piano maker who makes the piano can actually be valorized as someone contributing to productive labor. And he goes on to make an extraordinary sort of a metaphorical parallel with saying that anyone who thinks that something like service, which is a kind of pure action, a pure act of doing something like playing the piano, like the dancer dancing, who thinks that all of this can be thought of as work, as something which contributes to the evaluation or the valorization of productive work, is saying something to the effect that the madman's delusions can be counted as reality. So the parallel is so strong and so negative, while he completely accepts and even praises the aesthetic necessity of the playing of the piano as the very condition for making of the piano. But at the level of political economy, this hierarchy is completely reversed. So there is a kind of ontological conundrum here. It's something which is at the level of being, which precedes the making of something, the piano. In the hierarchy of valorization in capitalism, becomes not just a lower, not just on the lower side at a lower place, but something which is really to be dismissed. So at a later point, he also dismisses what he calls the services of everyone from popes to prostitutes, to be counted as part of something which is significant for political economy in the times of capitalism. So it is the very, well, I would go to the extent of saying the violent language, which is significant. Now, I'm going to come to an Italian author who has interpreted all of this very, very interestingly. And he is really the person who I'm going to discuss mostly in the next few minutes. But before that, there is an explanation for Marx's impatience and his dismissive, putting aside of all the services in the sense of all that is inseparable from the actual life of living labor, and which does not externalize itself into a finished work. So the painter's painting, for instance, is absolutely all right because the painting is a finished work. But the dancer's dance is not, the doctor's services are not. So what is the significance? What is really at stake in this hierarchy of significances? It seems to me that one of the more neglected parameters for evaluating this sort of a hierarchization is the political one. So to put it very quickly, though in my paper I've argued it out at some length, but to put it very quickly, the reason to put down service as something relatively insignificant, of course, there is a quantitative reason, Marx says, that compared to workers in manufacturing or not just manufacturing, but who actually manufacture in the generic sense, in the fundamental sense, who manufacture products. Services employ only a small number of people in society. But apart from that, there is the political reason that it seems that services are not immediately translatable into organized politics. Because services are a kind of isolating activity of life which do not enter into a common space of collective action, which, for instance, alienated industrial workers are in a better position to enter into. So in that sense, a fundamental rationality of politics as organized politics, which is based on a certain logic of alienation and a certain didactic logic of teaching oneself how to overcome this alienation collectively through, for instance, the mode of collective organization. That logic does not apply in the same way to services. So in that sense, we could make a distinction between services being alien to the very mode of organization, while the alienation of industrial workers who make products in the larger sense of manufacture actually becomes the very cultural and subjective condition for systematic political organization. Whether it be towards trade union sort of thresholds or towards more revolutionary orientations. Both these conditions do not, or both these possibilities don't seem to immediately apply to the situation of services. That seems to me to be one of the hypotheses that I would like to, put to you and ask you to think about seriously in interpreting Marx's this sort of impatience or even his violent dismissal. What is interesting is that in our own times, and I mean in our times, in the larger neoliberal sort of classification of historical phases of capitalism, in our times, among several others, we are really very fortunate to be able to read an Italian Marxist autonomist thinker, Paolo Verno, who wrote a long essay, a really important and important essay called Virtuosity and Revolution, the Political Theory of the Exodus, the political theory of Exodus. This essay is something which becomes my point of departure for really the hypotheses and the critique that I want to mount in the next few sections of my presentation. Paolo Verno, who is of course also a colleague of Antonio Negri's and Michael Hart's and several others, is someone who reads the very text that I've already foregrounded, which is the Grundrisse. And for those very sections that I have pointed out to you, the sections on labor and service. And he, in addition, actually articulates these sections of Marx in Grundrisse with another later section of Marx in Grundrisse on what Marx calls the general intellect. And he compares Marx with Hannah Arendt, taking some of Hannah Arendt's seminal classifications of conceptual categories as the sort of ground on which he makes this comparison. And that ground is, of course, where Hannah Arendt distinguished between action, labor, and work, which itself is based on Aristotle's distinction between poiesis and praxis, and of course, theory and all of that. Very quickly, the distinction basically signifies that in labor, which is oriented to work, something like a finished product is at stake, whether that be a car or that be a painting. While in action, something like a self-oriented goal making is at stake. So in Aristotle, ethics and politics is this domain for praxis, where the end of the action is its own self. The telos, the end of the action, which is praxis, is its own self, or is that action itself, which is ideally ethical action or political action. Uh, so he takes this distinction between action, work, and labor um, on the one side, and on the other side, he again goes back to the examples that I've already, mentioned to you from Marx, and takes, for instance, Marx's own examples of who are the ones who are employed in services, or who are the ones who are employed in what could be called um, performances. And the examples could be from dancers to teachers to orators to even politicians. And each of them really does what he or she does only to actually achieve or reach the goal of that very doing in the doing itself, instead of that action culminating in a finished work or a finished product. So Marx, again, uses the term service for all of these categories of work. And very interestingly, Paolo Verno uses another term for this kind of work. He calls all of this work, again, let's remember the examples, the performing artist, the dancer, the musician, the teacher, the orator, even the politician. They're all, Werner calls, types of virtuosic performances, of virtuosic work. He uses the term virtuosity. And virtuosity for him is something which, to begin with, it is a little, well, broad, not vague, but broad, for one can easily correlate virtuosity with something which is extremely specific in aesthetic. For instance, the virtuosity of the master of musical rendition, or an actor on stage, or even a mime and a dancer. And then you realize that Vernon really means virtuosity in a larger sense, or in a more fundamental sense. He, at a certain point, a later point, he speaks of virtuosity as something which is a faculty. And that's why the anthropological ground of his essay is already laid out, which I'm going to try and sort of redirect in a different direction. But he lays the ground for an anthropological understanding of virtuosity, which he says is a common human faculty. And what he means by virtuosity is really performance which is not finished, a kind of perpetually unfinished performance. In other words, a performance, and this is what I began with in my understanding of neoliberalism as life, a performance which cannot really be separated from the duration of living. And to understand this, very interestingly, we have Vernon consulting the later part of Marx's Grundrisse, where Marx proposes very cryptically, in a very compact way, a concept which Marx calls general intellect. And Marx really defines general intellect as social knowledge. It is knowledge, but it's not anyone's knowledge. It's not a possession of the subject of knowledge. It is the knowledge in which everyone seems to participate. But then it could easily be, rendered a very objective definition of general intellect, where Marx himself calls it fixed capital. So that fixed capital could be machinery, it could also be technology. But what is interesting is that Paolo Verno turns it around, and he says, actually, we need to think of general intellect in a more mobile way, in a more nomadic way. Instead of thinking it as fixed capital, we must think of it as something virtuosic, which means what? Which means, he says, that it is part of living labor, where really, to understand The true spirit of Werner's point, we must think of the living part more sort of seriously than the labor, which easily goes in the direction of what Hannah Arendt thought of, or even Marx, proposed to be really oriented to fit the finished work, which is an object standing outside the worker. But instead of that, if you put your attention towards, on the living part, then living becomes a kind of endless modulation. So this musical term modulation also comes from Werner, uh, which has to be taken very seriously, a kind of endless modulation or variation, or yes, virtuosity. And he says that it is this type of work, which of course is also work in the sense that a dancer finishes her dance and the actor finishes the performance, but as a model, it does not finish in a work. It does not finish in a product. And if it does not finish in a finished product, then in a sense, it is always living its life, let's say, in the interpretation of the viewers. So in that sense, it is a kind of subjective life, which can also become a collective life. It is a moment of, and very beautifully Werner puts it is a moment of human contact. So when an audience sees a performance, then it is really not just seeing a finished work, it is making human contact. And in that sense, the performer, the virtuoso performer, stands for a kind of universal human faculty, the faculty of living life not flatly, neither mechanically in the sense that life is lived to produce something outside itself, but lives life in a modulated way, in a virtuosic way. So in that sense, performance does not merely become a metaphor of life, but it becomes almost the very element of life. So you could, of course, using the vocabulary of cultural conceptualization, including that of performance studies, call it a kind of performativity. But Werner does not use this vocabulary. He simply calls it virtuosic, or he calls it a faculty. But he does distinguish it from, he takes the example of Glenn Gould, the great musical artist, who all his life played different versions of Bach, at different paces, at different sort of tempos. And in a sense, Glenn Gould is not someone who finishes his work with, which can always in our times record and make an object out of it with different renditions. Glenn Gould is really known as someone whose life might end, but whose work never ends, because he's someone who is continuously playing variations and modulations. In that sense, he's a true virtuoso. He's playing just one thing all his life, which never finishes. In that sense, also, it is a very accurate sort of image of life lived, which produces many things and yet does not produce anything which signifies the end of life, of living life, that is, or living labor into fixed capital. So at a kind of aesthetic vocabulary or signification, this mobilization of the language of virtuosity by Werner while reading Marx seems really very interesting, particularly when he puts together the labor service distinction in articulation with, in communication with general intellect. From which Werner comes to his main sort of purpose for that essay, to his political proposal. First of all, we have to keep in mind that Werner writes exactly in the framework that we have been, we are interested in, or I have sort of delineated for you, which is the framework of, now he does not use the terminology of neoliberalism. He calls it, like he and his autonomist comrades do, he calls it post-Fordist, which means that now the form of organization of production is not really staged or enacted in the unified disciplined space of the factory, of the manufacturing unit. So in that sense, you are really moving from the paradigm of production or the organization of production in manufacture to something else, which could be broadly called a capitalism of services. a capitalism which generalizes service as its main subjective orientation. That even the front office of a steel factory, which initially was only thought of as something external or just a kind of ceremonial entry into the real factory, now becomes the very heart of the very logic of capitalization. So the steel town that I come from in Chhattisgarh, where I grew up, we grew up looking at the machines and in a sense feeling the thrill of our parents working amidst machines and the boiling steel and the red fire and all of that. But it is even during my school days, towards the end of my school days, when computer technology was becoming more and more sort of used in making steel, with my own parents involved in that sort of work. I was kind of, and I don't remember the exact scenes, but it was transmitted to me that now the real sort of attraction of making steel was not anymore the great whirring of machines and the red fire of the molten steel, but it was molten iron. But it was a factory where everything was absolutely invisible. The steel had become invisible because everything was now being, or at least tendentially, being governed or being manipulated or being sort of directed by the computer. So of course, steel was being made inside, but the front of the curtains had dropped on steel making, which had become smooth, a kind of smooth space instead of the machine space. So it is in this kind of a subjective, in the environment of this kind of a subjective imagery, that Verno, in speaking of post-Fordist forms of organization, raises the question of two things. He says that it is at this threshold of production, we can extend this to the vocabulary of neoliberalism, I think, though for Verno, possibly neoliberalism is too cynical a word, but we'll come to that. So Verno really speaks of this threshold of the post-Fordist mode of organization as a threshold of a direct attribution of human life to capital. This, in Marxist terms, is the real subsumption of labor to capital, rather than merely the formal subsumption. So within that sort of a technical, scientific framework, the political proposal that Verno makes has actually a subtlety, a deep subtlety. The first thread of that subtle fabric is this, that it is clear that when human contact is made, you can keep going back to the example of a performance, an artistic performance, which makes human contact with the audience. When that sort of a contact is made, then something more than the work is at stake, something ontological, where the ontology of kind of being with is what grounds the specificity of the aesthetic experience. So in that sense, in a performance, we are already in more than a surplus of community beyond the performance itself. So this is, of course, the first premise. So in work, when it's work of service in the hospitality sector, something which requires, say, the call center industry, which requires immediate communication on the phone, when human speech is at stake. Verno's point is there is already a kind of surplus of signification beyond its economic one. But he does make this point that this should not be taken in an immediate romantic way, that the surplus is immediately available to us. It is, he says, it is actually something which leads to two things, and those are very important points. It leads to the fact that something which is a kind of regulatory to a coercive set of institutions must always guard over this surplus, or they must administer this surplus, because this invisible surplus can also become ungovernable. This leads to the administrative state, not the parliamentary governmental state, but a kind of bureaucratic administrative state. But it also leads to something else, which is of probably greater interest to us in the sense of society. or a logic of society. He says what it leads to, this very surplus, leads to a kind of logic where virtuosic labor becomes servile labor, which means what? Which means that when this excess of human community or human contact is intrinsic to the kind of work I'm doing, and if this surplus in itself does not get autonomy, then what it leads to is greater personal servility. So I'm not anymore performing for the contractual reason that I'm a professional performer. I'm performing in the old mode, a kind of feudal to casteist mode, for my master's pleasure. In which case I also become servile towards my audience or my master who I perform for. So virtuosity then becomes dependency, personal dependency. And that is the logic of neoliberalism also becoming neo-feudal. It is within this sort of a complex logic of a kind of paradoxical submission through a force which is ontologically autonomous, because it is based on an ontological being with a kind of collective potentiality, that Verno really proposes as politics. And here things become a little disappointing, I have to say. Because still here, the diagnosis, even with its difficulties, is extremely subtle and extremely sort of, it really opens one's eyes to the ways of looking at capitalism as subjective capitalism, or a capitalism of life. But it is when he makes his political proposal, which he calls exodus or exit, he really, well, I have to reduce this to a kind of almost corrosive summary, but let me do it. He really says that what is at stake here is the faculty of general intellect, which is the intellect, which is a faculty of really living, which is now being put to a kind of work, which is service, a kind of continuous service. And that very general intellect, which is also potentiality, a kind of surplus potentiality, a surplus virtuality of, sometimes he calls it public intellect, public intellectuality, not the intellectuality of intellectuals, very importantly, the intellectualities of everyone. So that public intellectuality itself must be the ground of a new politics. Now, this is clearly circular. This is clearly circular. The very general intellect, which is being mobilized by capitalism into new forms of surplus extraction, has to become the ground for a new politics, a new collective politics. So he says something quite provocative. He says, and it's a critique of, and it's a well-founded critique of contemporary politics of a kind of left activism. He says, today there is more thought on the side of capitalism than on traditional activism. And he means it rigorously. He means thought in the sense of general intellect. What he's really saying is capitalist managers exploit thought, which is general intellect, more than the militants of so-called those who think socialist politics are able to today. But he wants to turn it around, and for which he wants a kind of politics of exodus. But from here, there are a set of words that are used, which are beautiful, noble, elevating words: exodus, intemperance, and eventually revolution. But each of these words seem to point towards something like a handbook of political strategy, which is also ethical strategy, very reminiscent of Gilles Deleuze and Guattari's work, but I don't have to go into that, which is a strategy which does not seem to take into account anything which is in the nature of the conjuncture itself, the historicity of the conjuncture. Hence, the conclusion seems to be extremely, well, if not damning, the conclusion seems to be to raise deep doubts about this political prescription, because what he seems to be saying is essentially that the very mode of post-Fordist forms of organization, where thought is today working, but in a kind of perverted sort of exploitative manner, will, out of its own auto-organization, a kind of autopoietic organization, become a revolutionary potentiality. So there is clear Spinoza's language in the philosophical genealogy that he takes up, which is virtuality, And he, at the end of his essay, or towards the end of his essay, says something which is, again, extremely interesting and provocative. He says, today, our slogan is not Marx's slogan, which is, we have nothing to lose but our chains. Today, we have a lot of wealth, but this is the wealth of thought, the wealth of virtuality. Instead of the Marxian imagery, which is also an imagery of a kind of, he uses the word desperation of a working class in chains. So now, for the next, how much time do I have, Rasika, if I may know?
Yeah, about 5 to 7 minutes.
5 to 7. So I am short of time, but I'll try to sum up my my own response to this fascinating structure that Werner puts up, where he really uses this contrast between an old proletariat organization, the party, in other words, to this autopoietic, autonomous form of politics, which he really calls a kind of virtuality, the richness of virtuality. In trying to bypass these two forms, I will propose, and in a way, it's also to go back to the very word from Marx, proletariat, in a different way, where I'll really propose that the question of politics should be seen neither in the sense of something which is purely contingent immiseration, that poverty eventually leads to revolution out of some sort of mechanical logic of desperation, nor should it be seen as a kind of ontological virtuality which autopoietically leads to change, but should be seen in the light of something which could be called the rarity of politics. Neither poverty nor richness, but rarity. I don't have the time to argue this part out, but I would like to propose another way of looking at the question of virtuosity, which I will call the virtuosity, which I will interpret as virtuosity really oriented or being mobilized towards a neutralization of subjectivity in capitalism, for which I will quickly take the model genealogically, not literally, but genealogically, the model of a totally anachronistic disparate text, which is the Manusmriti. In the Manusmriti, unlike for the three Varnas, the Brahman and the Kshatriya and the Vaishya, for the Shudra, it is said that the Shudra must serve not in this capacity or that, but without resentment. This is Wendy Doniger's translation of the Sanskrit word anusua. It has been translated differently by different translators. We don't have the time to go into that, but it is very significant that when the Shudra is asked to serve without resentment, then it is not asked or not said what the Shudra actually feels. It is simply said that the Shudra must serve the three upper Varnas without resentment. This negative characterization is extremely pertinent to be used as a model for contemporary virtuosic work, it seems to me, as a different model from Werner's optimistic one. So if I quickly take the example of the airlines industry, where the so-called air hostess, which is a feminized position clearly, which a male worker could also employ, comes across to us and presents us with a certain set of human contacts based on the ontology of what Werner calls cooperation, then with the virtuosic success of having produced that result on us, which is really the result which makes us feel good, we do not know, we have no clue, not a trace, that what does she actually feel. So there is a complete blockage of subjectivity. So to that extent, it seems to me, the air hostess's work, which is a paradigm of virtuosic work, is also the work which completely obscures any sort of subjectivity, which I call a neutralized zero-degree subjectivity, which actually becomes the condition, according to me, of a neoliberal anthropology, where performance is both indeed anthropologically, so there I go with Werner, indeed anthropologically hyper-subjectivized, when everything is virtuosic and performative. Even working in a steel industry at one level is to participate in the making of steel which even in Nehru's times, I remember my father having spent 3 nights continuously in the factory when the first sort of consignment of steel was exported to some country. He came back with this sense of triumph that, this is what my mother tells me, came back with that sense of triumph having participated in nation building, which is clearly a subjective incorporeal virtuosic effect rather than the manufacturing effect. So that has been going on. But with the paradigm of virtuosic work having become the very form of the organization of neoliberalism as a direct attribution or a direct capture of life in society, it seems to me that even these affects, these emotions, these collective ideological imaginaries cannot be mobilized anymore. And that, to me, is the real political challenge. The political challenge of not extracting a subjectivity out of the virtuality suppressed by neutralization, which Varno speaks about, but actually to redefine and rethink the question of the subject itself. So I think philosophically, the mistake that Varno makes is to think of an anthropological subject, which is a kind of hyper-performing subject. But in a neoliberal society, and Byung-Chul Han, the German-Korean philosopher, has written the most powerful things about it, when neoliberalism is also a regime of hyper-objective performativity, when a sensor in a room is actually measuring our heartbeat, which is not subjective, but which is purely objective, when everything is already being objectively quantified by algorithms, and when even the CCTV cameras are meant to read our faces, for every twitch of muscle objectively being interpreted to mean something or the other. There, performativity is not only on the side of the subject, but it's on the side as much of something which is entirely objective, entirely finished and dead and fetishized. So in that sense, the question of performance as an optimistic idea of a kind of generic human faculty does not seem to me to be sufficiently either ontologically well-founded, because ontology has become too partisan already. What we really need is to rethink politics along the lines of history, historicity, the contingency of history, along which even a regime of neoliberalism has to be thought and rethought. But that story I can only tell another day, given that I've run out of time. But in question answer, we can definitely take it up. But in the true virtuosic spirit, let me leave my talk unfinished. Thank you very much.